Hi kids, how are you guys doing? I am so excited to be here with you today. My name is Mr. Wade, and it has been a while since I've got to talk to you guys. I think the last time I talked to you all was probably about 2 months ago when we were standing up talking about how King David was hiding in the back of a cave in the dark with his men, and Saul walks in, and Saul was walking in the dark and didn't see King David, and David reached up and cut off a piece of his robe and chased Saul out saying, "King Saul, King Saul." And King Saul said, "You could have killed me, but you didn't. You're more righteous than I am, David." And that was the last time I got to talk to you guys. And since then, we've had some pretty big things happen in our lives. We had this thing that we now call coronavirus show up, and I'm sure all of you have been hearing all about coronavirus. It doesn't let you go to school. It doesn't let you go play with your friends. It doesn't let you go out to eat and sit in a restaurant. It doesn't let you do so many things. And I know sometimes as adults, we just throw around these terms, coronavirus, and we don't really explain what they mean. So what we want to do today is I want to take a chance to explain two things to you. I want to tell you, first of all, what coronavirus is, and try to help you understand it a little bit better so you know what we're talking about. And then second, I want to remind you that God's still in charge, and that this hasn't changed, and that God hasn't changed, and God is still the same as 2 months ago when we were talking about King David and King Saul and what was happening in the back of the cave. So if you guys are ready, let's talk about coronavirus. First thing, when I say coronavirus, I want you to know that that actually has a specific meaning. My daughter gave this to me. I don't know if you guys can see what this is, but it looks a lot like a crown. And the reason I brought a crown in is because when you say corona, what that means is crown. And so this is actually called the crown virus, the coronavirus. And the reason we call it that is because when you take it and you take a microscope and you peer into the microscope, and you have to have a super powerful microscope, not something like this. But when you look in the microscope at coronavirus, it actually kind of looks like a crown. In fact, I brought a picture of it just because I'm that excited to share with you guys. If you could see it, it kind of looks like a crown. It's hard to imagine, I know, but you guys are kids and you have great imaginations. And you can kind of see the blue part, you can imagine that's kind of like a head, and the yellow part kind of looks like a crown. The part you can't see here is that there's little tiny spikes that come out, kind of like the top of a crown right here. And so coronavirus, we call it the crown virus. So viruses are super cool. If you don't know much about them, viruses are these little tiny things, and they are all around us, everywhere. You go up and you dig them up in dirt. You can wipe your hands on surfaces and they get on your hands, and they're nothing to be really afraid of because viruses are everywhere. In fact, scientists have even found out that our own bodies, the little genes, the little DNA, the little parts of our bodies that make us who we are, it contains about 8% virus DNA. So they are super cool, and not only are they super cool, but I want to remind you that God created them. Viruses didn't just appear out of nothing. God actually made viruses. If you remember all the way back in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and He goes through, and every day God creates something new. You'll remember in the book of Genesis, it doesn't say, "And on the fourth day God created viruses." But we know and we believe that God has created everything that we see and everything that we can't see. And so we know that God also created viruses. And we know that because God created viruses, we can believe that these things are also super cool and He's created them for a special good purpose. And that special good purpose is something we want to talk about today. So because there is a special good purpose for viruses, and because viruses, many of them do very good things, we want to take a better look at what coronavirus is actually doing today and why it is kind of scary, but at the same time, we can understand it a little better and see how God is still in charge. So let's take a better look at coronavirus. So to do this, we have to be detectives. So let me get my detective stuff on real quick. First thing you have to have is your detective coat. So I'm gonna get my detective coat on, if I can get it on. Next thing you need when you're a detective, you gotta have your detective handbook. In this case, it's my spy handbook. Next thing you need as a detective, everybody knows you need a magnifying glass. Because if you can have a magnifying glass, then you can see all sorts of things that are going on, especially things that are super small, like coronavirus. So let's start right over here. I have what I made to look like a coronavirus. Yes, it is a tennis ball with some spikes sticking out, kind of like a crown, just like we said. We're going to do an experiment with this pretend coronavirus. So on this tray here, I have powdered sugar. I'm going to take the coronavirus and I'm going to sit it down on this tray, and we're going to see what happens. Are you ready? Still waiting. Nothing happened. But I got another question. What if I took an ant and I put an ant on here? Or what if I took one of you and I put a little bit of powdered sugar out here and I left you in a room by yourself? Do you think that powdered sugar would be gone? Do you think that ant would eat the powdered sugar? Do you think you might lick up that powdered sugar? I know I would. It's been tempting not to lick up the powdered sugar sitting right there. But coronavirus, when you set it there, it doesn't do anything. You know why? Because it doesn't have a brain. Coronavirus doesn't have a brain. It doesn't have any feet, even though these things kind of look like feet. It can't even really move on its own. Coronaviruses aren't even alive. All viruses just sit there, and even if there's something that they really like, they just sit there. Something has to carry them, and something has to carry them around, whether it's the wind, whether it's an animal, whether they just sit there until someone comes along. All coronaviruses just sit there until someone does something with them. They're not going out trying to find you. They're not coming out trying to figure out where you're at and trying to figure out what they can do to hurt you. Coronaviruses just sit there until you do something with it. If you notice on the outside, these things poking out, what do they look a lot like? They look like a key, don't they? And we'll see why that's important. But what's really interesting is when you open up a coronavirus, there's only one thing inside. And it's a special code. Because remember, we're detectives, and every good detective story needs a secret code. I have got our secret code. Our secret code has A's, it has U's, it has C's, it has G's. And this is an actual secret code that's actually inside viruses. And these actual secret codes are actually inside viruses because God put them there. And because God put them there, they have a purpose. Now, when they're inside that virus, they don't do anything. They just sit there because, again, a virus has no brain and it just sits there. But when it gets inside a cell, when it gets inside a human, when it gets inside an animal, when it gets inside something else, all of a sudden there's little tiny machines in those cells that start to read this like a little code. So if you take your magnifying glass and you try to go A-A-U, it doesn't mean anything to you. But when you put a little machine on it, that machine starts to go along and it starts to say A-A-U, that is a yellow square. And then it goes through and it says C-C-C, that'll be a purple square. And it says G-A-C, that's a triangle. C-A-U will be a really big square. U-U-G, oh, that is this super cool shape right there. And then G-A-G, that's gonna be a pink square. And so those machines go along and they read out that entire code and say, this is what that code actually says. And they put together special chemicals and they build all this together. Now, when they build all this together, it doesn't just sit nice and neat and flat like this. That would be nice, wouldn't it? It actually changes. It starts to fold up. Because if you notice, how are these things holding together? Maybe you have some of them at home. They're called magnetiles because they've got magnets in them. These things hold together like magnets. They hold together, and then remember how magnets sometimes can push together, or sometimes they don't push together. They start to fold up. Magnets start to attract each other, and they fold into special shapes. And so the same thing happens. When the special little machines go through and read the secret code from the virus, it makes little chemicals that look like this. And then they fold up and they fold into super special shapes. Now, some of these shapes are all sorts of crazy different sizes. Today, we're going to think of those shapes like a key. So if this code makes a shape that looks like a key, then we can go through and it starts trying different things. It says, is this the right lock? Nope. Is this the right lock? Nope. Is this the right lock? It works. That's what these little codes do. They make special keys that go and find special locks, and when the special key finds the special lock, they work. And so let's go back to our coronavirus. Remember, our coronavirus has all of these little things on it. They look like keys, right? And so coronavirus, it moves around, and all of these little keys that are on the outside are looking for the right size of lock. So they move around. Is this the right lock? Nope. Is this the right lock? Nope. Is this the right lock? Nope. And they move around and around and around until finally they find the right lock. And when they find that right lock, they open it, and then they can move inside. Now, these right locks aren't just anywhere. It's not like there's a right lock over there or a right lock over there. These right locks for coronavirus are only in certain places inside our bodies. And it's not inside your hand. It's not inside your head. It's not even inside your toes. The special lock where the coronavirus gets is only inside your lungs. And so the only way that we can get coronavirus inside of us is if we find these coronaviruses and we breathe them in, or they somehow get into our eyes or our nose and can get down into our lungs. And if it gets down into our lungs, coronavirus finds the right place that has the right lock, and it can get inside. And when it gets inside, it shuts itself in. And once it's in, that's when the bad things start to happen. So let's think about what happens when a coronavirus gets in. Do you remember all those super little tiny machines that I was telling you about? The machines that go along and read the super secret code. As they read the super secret code, they say, it's a yellow square, it's a red square, it's all these different squares. And once they finally figure out what that is, they're starting to make new things. They're not just making keys, they're making whole new viruses. And so we've got this super secret virus that's inside a cell, and it doesn't just stay one virus. One virus turns into two. 2 turns into 4, 4 turns into 8, and they just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So a cell in your lungs that used to be maybe this size, once there's so many viruses in it, those viruses cause the cell to become this size. Eventually, hold on, we've got to do glasses in order to get ready for the science. Eventually, these cells get so full of virus that eventually they just go, and look what happens. Did you see all that white stuff that came out? That's all the little virus that starts spreading around and going to other cells. They move out with their little keys, and they try to find other places where there are little keys. And they search and they search and they search, and they start spreading out, and they start to infect inside our lungs. And then coronavirus can actually hurt people. And it hurts people because it makes it hard to breathe. It makes you want to start to cough. It makes you not feel very good. And so that's why coronavirus is bad. But remember how I said coronavirus, the only way that we can get it inside is if it gets into our lungs. And so that means if it gets in our mouth, our nose, or our eyes. And so there's a couple things that we have to make sure that we do. And I know you guys have heard this, but I want to show you why it's so important. So you have heard that people say, cover your sneezes, cover your coughs, and don't touch your face. I want to show you guys why that is so important with our coronavirus. I want to show you what happens when you sneeze with a virus, okay? So I'm going to put some of this powdered sugar. Remember earlier I said that powdered sugar looks pretty good. I can't wait to try some. This is when I was excited to try some. So I want to show you what happens when you sneeze. Are you ready? It goes pretty far, doesn't it? What about when we cough? It also goes pretty far, doesn't it? One last question though. What about if you get it on your hands? Does it stay on your hands? Or does it move other places? What do you think? Does it look like it gets other places? What if I move my hand across my mouth? Does it stay there? That's why it's so important. When we sneeze, or when we cough, or when we touch our face, that we cover our mouth and that we hand sanitize and wash our hands to get all the yucky stuff off of here. Remember, coronavirus isn't out there with the brain trying to find you and hurt you. Coronavirus is only getting moved when you do things like cough and sneeze, or touch your face and your eyes and your mouth and your nose. So that's why it's so important to do stuff like this. So I'm going to get out of this real quick. I'm going to clean up my space, and then I want to tell you how God is still in charge of this, because I know it's super confusing when you think coronavirus, it doesn't actually hurt me, or it's not trying to hurt me, but it feels like it is. So I want to tell you how God is still in charge, even of the coronavirus. Now that I'm changed, I think we can finally talk about why it is so important that we remember that God is still in control, even of the tiniest things. So if you remember back at the beginning of this, I told you that God, in the beginning, created everything seen and unseen, including coronavirus. I know you can't see it. I know that sometimes it's hard to even believe it's there, but it is, and God created it, and God created it for such a good purpose. But coronavirus hurts us now. We saw how it can get in our lungs and spread out, and we know that it is causing people to get sick, and that is sad. And that's a really sad thing, and that makes us sad. But what we remember is that God, who created it, is the same God who has done all of the other good things. We know that God, who has created a virus, has done it for his good purposes. And so we believe that somehow, some way, God is using even a coronavirus to change people's hearts and bring people back to Him, because we believe that God has done this before. Do you guys remember the stories that we've been talking about at church? I know it was a couple months ago, but we talked about Moses with the Israelites. And remember how the Israelites, as they came out of Egypt, who brought them out? It wasn't Moses. It was God who brought them out. They were in a terrible situation and God saved them. They got to the Red Sea, and when they got to the Red Sea, what happened? God saved them. They got into the desert and they had nothing to drink and nothing to eat, and who saved them? God saved them. They got to the Jordan River and they were getting ready to cross into the Promised Land, and there were people there that seemed so big and so scary, and they terrified the people, but who was with them? God was with them. And when they moved into the land, there were the judges who continually called God's people back to Himself. God was always saving His people. God was always in control, even when everything seemed so sad and the people were like, I don't want to have this anymore. I don't want to eat that manna that God gave us. That bread tastes terrible. God, give us water. Did you bring us out into the desert to die? God always had a plan. God was saving His people. Even with coronavirus, God has always had a plan. Ever since the beginning of time, God has had a plan for this. And we could trust that and we could believe it. Now, I know that it's hard to believe that God actually does have a plan in this. And it's hard to believe because we're just one person, or our family is maybe just a couple people. And so it's hard to see what God is doing in the rest of this great big world. But that's where we believe that God is still working. That's where we believe that God is doing great things. And so I want to thank you guys for hanging out in your homes and doing such a great job. I know it is so hard not going to school and seeing your friends. I know it is so hard not being able to go out and play soccer and baseball and all of the fun things that you want to do. I know it's so hard to not be able to go to the park with your friends. But thank you for the things that you're doing. I want to remind you of something too. In just a couple weeks, we get to celebrate a couple things. We get to remember Good Friday and we get to celebrate Easter. And I think it's really interesting that we get to do that now, because on Good Friday, there was somebody else who felt really alone. There was somebody else who was separated from everybody else for so long. It was Jesus. Remember, Jesus on Good Friday, way back 2,000 years ago, when He went to pray the night before He was going to die on the cross, He asked His disciples to come with Him, and what'd they do? They fell asleep. And then Jesus, as He's walking back, He tells His friend Peter, who's supposed to be one of His best friends, hey, you're going to forget who I am and you're going to pretend like you don't even know me 3 times. And what happened? 3 times. His so-called best friend says, I don't know who that guy is. Jesus was all alone. Even on the cross, Jesus, as He's hanging on the cross, cries out to God and says, God, why have you forsaken me? God, why did you abandon me? And He gets no answer. So while Jesus is hanging on the cross, taking all of our sins on Him, He was so alone. He was isolated. And He did that all for us. He knows how you feel. He knows what it's like to be alone. He knows what it's like not to be around your friends. He knows what it's like to be in situations where it's just hard. He's been there. And because He's been there, we can believe that He is going to save us. Because remember, on Easter morning, we remember that Jesus didn't just stay dead. He didn't just die on the cross, save us from our sins, and lay in a grave dead forever. Instead, on Easter morning, we celebrate that Jesus came back to life, and He came back for us. And He came back and He lived with us and lived among us. And people saw Him, and people heard Him, and people got to actually put their fingers in the scars on His hands. And people saw who Jesus was, because Jesus said, I love you so much, I am coming back for you. And Jesus conquered death, and He conquered coronavirus, and He came back for us. And because He came back for us, we can believe that He will come back for us, and He will rescue us from coronavirus. And the other exciting part from that is that Jesus didn't come back to the earth and live here again forever. He went back up to heaven and He said, there's somebody else coming. And that person is my Spirit, and that person's going to come and He's going to live inside of you, so you never have to be alone again. So that just like I had to suffer on the cross alone with no one around me, and even my best friend saying, I don't know Him. Even still, Jesus said, my Spirit's going to come back. He'll live inside of you, and you will never be alone again. And so in times of coronavirus, where it's so tough to believe that God is doing anything, we trust, as people who love God, that somehow, some way, God is taking this little tiny virus, well, much littler than this. He's taking this little virus and He is putting His Spirit in more people, and He is turning people's hearts around this great big world back to Himself. We believe that and we trust that. Guys, I know that it is scary, and that's okay. We can trust that God is working in this. We can trust that God is still in control and that God is still in charge of coronavirus. And so I don't know when it's going to be that we get to meet again and we get to tell stories, but I can tell you that when we get to meet again, it is going to be such a happy, glorious time, because together you and me and all of the people in our church are going to get together. And not just in our church, all the people around the world are going to get together, and we're going to celebrate how great God is, because like He brought the Israelites through in the desert, like He brought them out of Egypt, God is bringing us through this now. We believe that and we trust in that. Guys, we love you. I love you. The people in this church love you. The staff of this church loves you. We can't wait to see you again. We don't know when that's going to be, but we are excited for that day to come, and we believe that God's going to bring it soon.